Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Imagine discovering that your late father's cherished belongings, things you thought were safe, had been sold without your knowledge. Now, imagine confronting the person responsible, only to be told you're overreacting. That's exactly what happened to me, and it changed the way I saw my family forever. My dad passed away when I was 15, and his death left a hole in my life that could never be filled. He wasn't just my father. He was my hero. He had this way of making everything feel special, from family dinners to impromptu road trips. One of my favorite memories was watching him with his old cameras. He had a passion for photography and a knack for capturing moments that made them feel timeless. He'd take his cameras out during birthdays, holidays, or even lazy Sunday afternoons. Each photo he took seemed to carry a piece of his warmth and love. When he passed, those cameras, along with his favorite leather jacket and an old watch he cherished, became symbols of who he was. They weren't just objects. They were his essence, preserved in tangible form. After his funeral, my mom packed up most of his belongings. She said we'd go through them when we were ready. I didn't argue. At 15, I wasn't ready to say goodbye to him, let alone his things. I assumed they were safe, stored in the attic or the garage, waiting for a day when I'd have the strength to look through them. The years passed, and life moved forward, as it always does. By the time I was in college, my mom had met someone new. She started dating Gary, a man who seemed nice enough. He wasn't overbearing or pushy, which I appreciated. If anything, he seemed to go out of his way to respect my boundaries. I didn't begrudge my mom for moving on. I wanted her to be happy, and if Gary brought her joy, I wasn't going to stand in the way. At first, he was polite and easygoing, always asking how school was going or if I needed anything. He never tried to replace my dad, which made it easier to accept him. But as time went on, little things started to feel off. Gary had a habit of subtly inserting himself into our family dynamics. He'd rearrange things in the house without asking, claiming it was more practical his way. He started calling the house our home, which always made me bristle. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my own resistance to change. After all, Gary wasn't a bad guy. He didn't raise his voice or try to control my mom. But there was something about the way he made himself at home that didn't sit right with me. I didn't think much about my dad's belongings until one weekend during my junior year of college. I was home for a short visit, and I felt a sudden urge to look through his things. It had been years since I'd thought about them, but the idea of reconnecting with those pieces of him felt comforting. "Hey, Mom," I said casually over breakfast, "where's Dad's stuff?" "The cameras and his old jacket?" I was thinking it might be nice to go through it. Her fork paused midair, and for a moment, she looked caught off guard. "Oh, I think Gary might have moved some things around in the garage," she said, avoiding my eyes. "You'll have to check there." Her response was vague, but I didn't press her. I assumed the boxes were still safely tucked away somewhere. My mom wasn't the sentimental type, but she wasn't careless either. I trusted her to have kept Dad's things intact. That afternoon, I ventured into the garage, expecting to find a dusty corner with neatly stacked boxes labeled with my dad's name. What I found instead was a meticulously organized space that looked nothing like I remembered. Shelves were lined with storage bins labeled tools, Christmas decorations, and sports gear. I searched every inch, but there was no sign of the boxes that had held my dad's belongings. Confused, I went back inside and asked Gary if he knew where they were. He glanced up from the newspaper, his expression annoyingly casual. "Oh, we cleared out a bunch of stuff last year," he said. "Your mom and I figured it was just old junk taking up space." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean by cleared out?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Gary shrugged. "We sold some things at the yard sale. Donated the rest." "Why?" I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. "You sold it?" I said, my voice rising. "You sold my dad's belongings?" He gave me a puzzled look, as if I were the one being unreasonable. "It wasn't anything important," he said. "Just some old stuff collecting dust. Your mom said it was fine." I didn't know whether to scream or cry. Those weren't just old things. They were the last tangible connections I had to my dad. And now, they were gone. That night, I confronted my mom, hoping there was some kind of misunderstanding, but her response only deepened the betrayal. "Sweetheart, you're overreacting," she said dismissively. "It was just a few old items. Your dad wouldn't have wanted us holding on to all that stuff forever." Her words felt like a slap in the face. My dad, the man who had cherished every moment with our family, wouldn't have wanted us to keep his things? It didn't make sense. "They weren't just things," I said, my voice shaking. They were Dad. They were all I had left of him. My mom sighed, as if I were being unreasonable. I'm sorry you feel that way, she said, her tone devoid of real apology. But you can't hold on to the past forever. I walked away from that conversation feeling more alone than ever. My dad's memory deserved better than this. And so did I. When I decided to go home for a long overdue visit, I wasn't expecting anything unusual. I hadn't been back in months, and I was looking forward to a quiet weekend with my mom, catching up and maybe indulging in a little nostalgia. It had been a tough semester at college, and the thought of reconnecting with my dad's belongings gave me a strange sense of comfort. After dinner on the first night, I brought it up casually. Hey, Mom, I said, keeping my tone light. Do you know where Dad's old things are? The cameras and his jacket and all that? I was thinking it might be nice to go through them. She froze for just a moment, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. It was subtle, but I caught it. Then she quickly recovered, plastering on a smile. Oh, those old things? I think Gary might have reorganized the garage a while back. You should check there. There was something about the way she said it, too breezy, too dismissive, that set off an alarm in my head. But I brushed it aside, assuming she just didn't want to talk about Dad's stuff. I figured she wasn't ready to open that chapter of her life again. The next morning, I made my way to the garage, expecting to find the familiar cluttered chaos of tools, old decorations, and random boxes that had been there since my childhood. But when I opened the door, I was taken aback. The garage was spotless, unnervingly so. The once cluttered shelves were now lined with matching storage bins, each labeled with Gary's impeccable handwriting. Holiday decorations, sports equipment, garden tools. There wasn't a single unlabeled box or stray item in sight. For a moment, I stood there, dumbfounded. This wasn't the garage I remembered. It felt like a stranger's space. I started searching, pulling down bins and opening lids, convinced that somewhere in this overly organized maze, I'd find the box with my dad's things. But as I went through shelf after shelf, my heart began to sink. It wasn't there. By the time I'd gone through the entire garage, I was sweating and frustrated. The box was gone, and with it, the things that had kept my dad's memory alive. I found Gary sitting in the living room, sipping coffee and flipping through a newspaper, looking as if he didn't have a care in the world. I walked in, trying to keep my voice steady. Hey, Gary, I said. Do you know what happened to my dad's stuff? The cameras, the jacket, his watch? I couldn't find them in the garage. He looked up from his paper, his expression annoyingly casual. Oh, we cleaned out the garage last year, he said with a shrug. Your mom and I thought it was time to get rid of some of the old clutter. Why? I felt a knot form in my stomach. What do you mean by cleaned out? I asked, my voice a little sharper. He gave me a puzzled look, like I was the one being unreasonable. We sold some things at the yard sale. Donated the rest. Your mom said it was okay. My heart started pounding. You sold it? I said, my voice rising. You sold my dad's belongings? Gary sighed, setting down his coffee cup. It was just old stuff, he said dismissively. Junk. Really? I didn't think it was a big deal. I could barely breathe. It wasn't just stuff, I said, my voice trembling. It was my dad's. His cameras, his jacket, his watch. They weren't junk. They were important to me. Gary shrugged again, and I wanted to scream. Look, if it meant that much to you, you should have taken it when you moved out, he said, his tone almost condescending. We figured you didn't want it, since it had been sitting there for years. I stared at him, stunned. How could he be so casual about this? About something so personal, so irreplaceable? Fighting back tears, I went to find my mom. She was in the kitchen, washing dishes as if nothing had happened. Mom, I said, my voice cracking, Gary just told me you sold Dad's things. Is that true? She turned, a faint look of guilt flickering across her face before she quickly masked it. Oh, sweetheart, she said, her tone overly sympathetic. We just needed to make some space. It was mostly old stuff. Nothing valuable. Nothing valuable? I repeated, incredulous. It wasn't about value. It was about Dad. How could you let him sell it without even asking me? She sighed, clearly exasperated. You've never asked about that stuff before, she said. It's been years, and it was just sitting there, collecting dust. Your dad wouldn't have wanted us to hold on to it forever. Her words hit me like a slap. You didn't even think to ask me? I said, my voice rising. That wasn't yours to get rid of. It was his. It was all I had left of him. Her expression hardened. I think you're overreacting, she said, her tone clipped. It's just stuff. And it's not healthy to hold on to things forever. You need to move on. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Move on, I said, my voice shaking. You don't get to decide when I'm ready to let go of my dad. Those were his things, his memories. And now they're gone because you and Gary decided they didn't matter. She didn't respond, just turned back to the sink, clearly done with the conversation. I walked out of the kitchen, my chest tight with anger and heartbreak. My dad's belongings, his legacy, were gone, and the people who were supposed to protect those memories had treated them like garbage. And for the first time, I realized just how little they understood me, or cared. After tearing through every storage spot in the house, the garage, the attic, even the back of the closets, I had nothing to show for it. The boxes that once held my dad's cameras, his vintage watch, and the old leather jacket he wore everywhere were nowhere to be found. It wasn't just frustrating, it was devastating. Those items were like pieces of him, fragments of the life we had before everything changed. I sat on the floor of the garage, surrounded by neatly labeled bins that meant nothing to me, and tried to piece together what had happened. The house felt different now, too clean and devoid of any trace of my dad. It wasn't just the missing belongings. It was the realization that they'd been erased, like he hadn't mattered enough to hold on to. My mom had been no help. Every time I pressed her, she waved me off with vague responses like, "I'm sure it's around here somewhere," or, "Gary probably just reorganized." But I knew better. The sinking feeling in my gut told me something was wrong. I found Gary in the backyard, fiddling with the grill as if this were just another ordinary day. My hands were shaking as I approached him, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Gary," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "What happened to my dad's belongings? His cameras, his jacket, his watch. Where are they?" He didn't even look up at first, focusing on adjusting the grill's knobs. When he finally turned to me, he looked mildly irritated, like I was interrupting something important. "What do you mean?" he said, his tone casual. "I mean the boxes," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "The ones with my dad's things. They're not in the garage, or the attic, or anywhere else in the house." "Where are they?" Gary sighed, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Oh, that stuff? We sold some of it at the yard sale last year. Donated the rest." "Why?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at him, unable to process what he'd just said. "You sold it?" I said, my voice cracking. "You sold my dad's belongings?" He shrugged, completely unfazed by my reaction. "It wasn't anything important," he said. "Just some old junk collecting dust. Your mom said it was fine." I felt the floor drop out from under me. My dad's belongings weren't junk. They were everything I had left of him, memories I hadn't been ready to let go of. "How could you do that?" I asked, my voice rising despite my attempts to stay calm. "That wasn't yours to sell. That wasn't even Mom's to sell. It was his. It was all I had left of him." Gary rolled his eyes, as if I were being unreasonable. "Look, it was just sitting there," he said. "Nobody had touched it in years. We figured you didn't want it anymore." "You figured?" I repeated, incredulous. "You didn't even ask me. You just assumed it didn't matter?" He folded his arms, his tone turning defensive. "Why are you getting so worked up? It was old stuff. You're making a big deal out of nothing." "A big deal out of nothing?" I said, my voice breaking. "Those cameras, he used them to take pictures of our family. That jacket, he wore it every day. That watch, it was a gift from my grandfather. And you just got rid of them like they were trash?" Gary didn't respond. He just stood there, looking annoyed, like this conversation was an inconvenience. I stormed back into the house, my chest tight with anger and heartbreak. My mom was in the kitchen, flipping through a magazine, completely oblivious to the fact that my entire world felt like it was crumbling. "Mom," I said, barely holding back tears, "did you know Gary sold Dad's things? The cameras, the jacket, the watch, they're all gone." She looked up, startled, but quickly composed herself. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, her tone placating. "I thought you knew. We talked about cleaning out the garage ages ago." "No, you didn't," I said, my voice shaking. "You never told me. You never asked me. You just let him sell everything like it didn't matter." My mom sighed, setting down her magazine. "It wasn't like that," she said. "We needed to make some space, and those things had been sitting there for years. Your dad wouldn't have wanted us to hold on to them forever." Her words felt like another betrayal. "Don't tell me what Dad would have wanted," I said. "He would have wanted me to have the choice. He would have wanted me to decide when I was ready to let go, not you or Gary." She gave me that same exasperated look she always did when I was upset, like I was being dramatic. I think you're overreacting, she said, her tone clipped. It was just stuff. You're holding onto the past too tightly, and that's not healthy. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It wasn't just stuff, I said, tears streaming down my face. It was him. It was all I had left of him, and now it's gone because you couldn't be bothered to ask me if I cared. She didn't respond, just looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and discomfort. I turned and walked out of the room, feeling like I just lost my dad all over again. The cameras, the jacket, the watch, they were gone. But worse than that, the people who were supposed to protect those memories had let me down in the most callous way imaginable. I didn't just feel hurt, I felt betrayed. And I knew then that things between us would never be the same. I stormed into the kitchen, furious and still shaking from my confrontation with Gary. My mom was leaning against the counter, scrolling on her phone, blissfully unaware of the emotional grenade that had just gone off in my chest. For a moment, I just stood there, trying to compose myself, but the words came tumbling out before I could stop them. Mom, did you know Gary sold Dad's things? I demanded, my voice trembling. She looked up, startled, but quickly adjusted her expression into something neutral. What do you mean? She asked, feigning ignorance. I slammed my hands on the counter. I mean, the cameras, the jacket, the watch, everything. He told me he sold them at the yard sale. Did you know about this? Her face softened, but not in the way I expected. Instead of concern, she gave me that same placating look she used when I got upset about trivial things as a kid, like when she wouldn't let me stay up late. Sweetheart, you're overreacting, she said gently. Overreacting? I repeated, my voice rising. He sold Dad's belongings without even asking me. How is that overreacting? She sighed and set her phone down, clearly irritated that I was interrupting whatever she'd been doing. Look, your dad wouldn't have wanted us to hold on to all that stuff forever, she said. It was just sitting there, taking up space. We needed to make room, and Gary was just trying to help. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. Make room? For what? For Gary, I said, unable to keep the venom out of my voice. That wasn't just stuff, Mom. That was Dad. It was all I had left of him. She folded her arms, her expression hardening. It wasn't all you had left, she said coolly. You have memories, photos. You don't need a bunch of old junk cluttering up the house to remember your dad. Her words stung more than I could have imagined. It wasn't junk, I said, tears welling up in my eyes. Those cameras, he used them to take pictures of us. That jacket, he wore it everywhere. And that watch, it was from Grandpa. How could you let Gary get rid of them without even telling me? She rolled her eyes, something she rarely did, and it felt like another slap in the face. You've never even asked about that stuff before, she said. It's been years, and you never showed any interest in going through it. How were we supposed to know it mattered so much to you? Because it was Dad's. I shouted, my voice breaking. I thought it was safe. I thought you were keeping it for me. I didn't think I had to fight for the right to keep my father's memory alive. Her face softened slightly, but it didn't feel like an apology. I'm sorry you're upset, she said, her tone still dismissive. But you can't hold onto the past forever. Life moves on, and you need to move on, too. I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. Move on, I said, my voice shaking with anger. You don't get to decide when I move on, Mom. You don't get to tell me when I'm ready to let go of Dad. And you definitely don't get to let someone else erase him like he didn't matter. She opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off. You knew, I said, pointing a trembling finger at her. You knew how much those things meant to me. You just didn't care enough to ask. You let Gary take over, and now it's all gone. Her face hardened again, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, the tension between us thicker than it had ever been. Finally, she spoke, her voice cold and clipped. I'm sorry you feel that way, she said, the words robotic and empty. But what's done is done. There's no point in dwelling on it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My mom, the woman who had always told me how important family was acting like my dad's memory didn't matter. I'll tell you what's done, I said, my voice low and trembling with fury. What's done is my trust in you. What's done is me believing you cared about what Dad left behind. And what's done is me letting Gary treat this house and Dad's legacy like it's his to erase. She didn't respond. She just turned back to her phone, as if the conversation was over. I walked out of the kitchen, my heart pounding and my hands shaking. I didn't just feel angry, I felt betrayed. My mom had always been my rock, the one person I could count on to understand me. But in that moment, she felt like a stranger. I went to my room and sat on the bed, staring at the wall. I thought about the cameras, the jacket, the watch, and all the other things that were now gone forever. My dad had always told me that family was the most important thing in life. But now, I wasn't sure what family even meant anymore. The thought of my dad's belongings being lost forever was unbearable. I couldn't sit idly by while the last tangible pieces of him slipped further away. Despite my mom's dismissiveness and Gary's indifference, I knew I had to do something. I didn't care how long it took or how difficult it would be. I needed to find out where his things had gone. The first lead came from a fleeting memory. A neighbor had mentioned the yard sale when it happened. She'd casually commented on the treasures Gary had been selling, and at the time, I hadn't thought much of it. Now, that offhand remark felt like a lifeline. I knocked on her door the next day, trying to keep my desperation from showing. "Hi, Mrs. Henderson," I said, forcing a smile. "I need your help. Do you remember the yard sale my mom and Gary had last year? Do you know who bought the cameras, or the other old things they were selling?" Mrs. Henderson looked surprised but thoughtful. "Oh, yes, I remember," she said, inviting me inside. "I don't know everyone who came by, but I think the cameras were sold to Mr. Blake, you know, the man who collects antiques. He might know more." Armed with the name, I set off to track down Mr. Blake. He lived in the neighborhood, a few blocks away, and when I knocked on his door, I could barely keep my hands from shaking. He answered with a friendly smile, but I wasted no time with pleasantries. "Hi, Mr. Blake," I said. "My name's your name, and I think you bought some cameras at a yard sale my mom and stepdad had last year. They belong to my dad, and they're really important to me. I was wondering if you still have them." His face lit up with recognition. "Oh, yes, I remember those cameras," he said. "They were beautiful pieces, real classics. I'm sorry, though, I don't have them anymore. I sold them to a collector from the next town over." My heart sank, but I refused to give up. "Do you remember the collector's name?" I asked. Mr. Blake thought for a moment. "I think his name was Sam. Sam Porter. He's a well-known collector. He's even got a little shop on Main Street in Ashfield. If anyone still has the cameras, it'll be him." I thanked him profusely, my chest buzzing with a mix of hope and dread. It wasn't much, but it was a lead, a breadcrumb on the trail to recovering what Gary had so carelessly discarded. The search became my obsession. Every free moment was spent calling, visiting, and following up on leads. I combed through yard sale groups online, hoping someone might recognize the other items. My dad's leather jacket, his vintage watch, or even smaller pieces like his old photo albums. Most of the buyers I tracked down were sympathetic but unhelpful. One woman remembered buying a box of random knickknacks, but she'd already donated them to a charity shop. Another man vaguely recalled the leather jacket, but had no idea where it was now. Every dead end felt like a punch to the gut, but I kept going. Each call, each visit, each new lead was a thread I clung to, no matter how frayed. Finally, I made it to Sam Porter's shop in Ashfield. The place was filled with shelves of vintage cameras, antique radios, and other nostalgic treasures. My heart raced as I stepped inside, scanning the room for something familiar. "Can I help you?" a man asked, stepping out from behind the counter. "Are you Sam Porter?" I asked. "Yes, I am," he said with a smile. I explained everything, how the cameras had belonged to my late father, how they were sold without my knowledge, and how much they meant to me. I must have looked desperate because his expression softened. "I do remember those cameras," he said. "They were beautiful pieces. But I sold them a few months ago to another collector." "I'm sorry." His words crushed me, but I pressed on. "Do you know who bought them? Is there any way I can contact them?" Sam nodded. "I can check my records and see if I have their information. Give me a moment." As he searched through his files, I felt my hope hanging by a thread. The cameras were slipping further and further away, passing from one hand to another like they were just objects, not the precious pieces of my dad they truly were. When Sam returned with a name and number, I almost cried with relief. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was something. "It's not too late," I told myself as I left the shop. "I can still get them back." The search wasn't over, and I didn't know how long it would take. But giving up wasn't an option. Those items were more than belongings. They were memories, pieces of a legacy that deserved to be preserved. And no matter how many obstacles I faced, I was determined to reclaim them. My search for my dad's belongings had become an all-consuming mission. Every spare moment was spent following leads, scrolling through online marketplaces, or reaching out to people who might know something. Some days were hopeful, filled with small victories like finding someone who remembered seeing the cameras or the jacket. Other days felt like endless dead ends, with one more person telling me they didn't have what I was looking for. Then, one night, while scrolling through an online auction site, I saw it. A watch. My dad's watch. The familiar scuffs on the leather strap, the subtle wear on the face. It was unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat as I clicked on the listing to confirm what I already knew. The seller's description only added to my certainty. They described it as a vintage piece, well-loved, but still in good condition. And then came the kicker, the price. It was listed for 10 times its original value. My dad's watch, a sentimental heirloom, was being treated like some rare artifact for profit. I messaged the seller immediately, my fingers trembling as I typed. I tried to sound calm and professional, asking if the watch was still available and if they consider holding it for a few days. To my surprise, they responded quickly. Yes, it's still available, they wrote, but I'm firm on the price. I bought it at a flea market, and I know what it's worth. I wanted to scream. This wasn't about market value or collectible status. It was about reclaiming a piece of my dad that never should have been lost. I explained the situation as best I could, telling them the watch had belonged to my late father and had been sold without my knowledge. I begged them to hold it for me while I figured out how to pay for it. The seller's response was polite but firm. I understand how much it means to you, but I can't sell it for less than the asking price. If you can pay, I'll hold it until the end of the week. Otherwise, I'm sorry. I stared at the message, tears welling up in my eyes. The price was far more than I could afford, especially on my limited college budget, but I couldn't let the watch slip through my fingers. It was too important. That night, I did something I swore I'd never do. I called my mom for help. When she answered, her voice was casual, like she hadn't noticed the tension between us during my last visit. "Hi, sweetheart," she said. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. "I found Dad's watch," I said, skipping the pleasantries. "Someone's selling it online, but it's expensive. I need some money to buy it back." There was a long pause, and for a moment, I thought she was going to say yes. But then she sighed. "I think you need to let this go," she said. Her words felt like a punch to the gut. "Let it go?" I repeated, my voice trembling. "Mom, this is Dad's watch. It's not just some random item. It's a piece of him. How can you tell me to let it go?" She sighed again, her tone growing sharper. "You're getting too attached to these things," she said. "It's not healthy. Your dad wouldn't want you to hang on to the past like this." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "It's not about the past," I said, my voice rising. "It's about what's right. That watch wasn't yours to sell, and now I'm trying to fix what Gary destroyed. Can't you see how much this means to me?" "I think you're letting your emotions cloud your judgment," she said coolly. "It's just a watch, sweetheart. It's not going to bring your dad back." The words hit me like a slap in the face. I felt the tears spilling over as I tried to respond. "It's not just a watch," I said, my voice shaking. "It's the watch he wore every day. It's the watch he always promised he'd pass down to me. And now it's in the hands of a stranger because you didn't care enough to protect it." My mom's tone turned defensive. "That's not fair," she said. "We didn't know how much it meant to you. And honestly, it's not worth getting this upset over." "It's worth everything to me," I said. "But clearly, that doesn't matter to you." I hung up before she could respond, the weight of her indifference crushing me. My own mother couldn't, or wouldn't, understand how much this meant. The watch was more than an object. It was a symbol of my dad's love, of the promises he made but never got to fulfill. That night, I stayed up trying to figure out how to come up with the money. I considered asking friends for a loan or selling some of my own belongings. But no matter how I spun it, the price felt impossible. The watch was so close, yet just out of reach. And for the first time, I wondered if I'd ever be able to reclaim what had been lost, or if I'd have to let go, just as my mom so callously suggested. By the time I reached my mom's house, I was practically shaking. The drive over had been a blur of angry thoughts and imagined confrontations. Her dismissal on the phone the night before, paired with Gary's cavalier attitude, had pushed me past the point of calm reasoning. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I was furious. When I walked through the front door, my mom and Gary were in the living room, sitting side by side on the couch. They looked comfortable, like everything was fine. My mom was flipping through a magazine, while Gary sipped coffee, the TV playing softly in the background. They both looked up when I entered, my mom smiling briefly before her expression turned cautious. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, her voice light. "We weren't expecting you." I didn't bother with pleasantries. "How could you?" I said, my voice trembling as I stepped further into the room. "How could you let him sell Dad's things like they didn't matter?" My mom blinked, clearly caught off guard by the intensity of my tone. Gary, however, barely reacted. He set his coffee cup down and gave me the same casual shrug he always did. It was just stuff, he said, his voice infuriatingly calm. You're making a big deal out of nothing. His words made my blood boil. Just stuff? I repeated, my voice rising. It was Dad's. Those cameras, that watch, his jacket, they weren't junk, Gary. They were all I had left of him, and you sold them without even asking me. Gary leaned back in his seat, his face unreadable. You weren't using any of it, he said. It was just sitting in the garage. We figured you didn't care about it anymore. I turned to my mom, desperate for some kind of support, but her expression was carefully neutral. Mom, I said, pleading, how could you let this happen? You knew how much those things meant to me. How could you just let Gary throw them away like they didn't matter? She sighed, setting her magazine aside. I think you're blowing this out of proportion, she said, her tone calm but dismissive. I know you're upset, but your dad wouldn't have wanted you to hold on to all that stuff forever. It's not healthy to cling to the past. Her words hit me like a slap. Cling to the past? I said, my voice breaking. I'm not clinging to the past. I'm trying to hold onto the only pieces of Dad I have left. You didn't just sell stuff. You sold memories. You sold him. My mom looked uncomfortable for a moment, but she quickly masked it with that same dismissive expression she always used when I got emotional. Sweetheart, I understand that you're upset, but we needed to make space. The garage was a mess, and it's not like you were using any of it. That wasn't your decision to make. I shot back. Those things weren't yours. They weren't even Gary's. They were Dad's, and by extension, they were mine. You had no right to sell them. Gary rolled his eyes, clearly tired of the conversation. Look, he said, leaning forward, I get that you're sentimental, but this is ridiculous. It was a bunch of old junk. You need to stop acting like we did something wrong. You did do something wrong, I said, glaring at him. You took things that didn't belong to you and sold them without permission. You didn't even think about what they might mean to me. You just decided they didn't matter because they didn't matter to you. My mom stood up then, holding up her hands like she was trying to defuse the situation. This isn't helping anyone, she said. What's done is done. There's no point in dredging all this up again. It's time to move on. Her words felt like a dagger to the heart. Move on, I said, tears spilling over now. Don't you dare tell me to move on. You're not the one who lost Dad. You're the one who replaced him. You let Gary come in here and erase everything that made this house feel like his. And now you're telling me to move on? That's not fair, she said, her voice growing sharper. You have no idea how hard it was for me after your dad died. I did my best to keep this family together, and you're acting like I've done something unforgivable. I stared at her, stunned by her defensiveness. You didn't keep this family together, I said quietly. You let Gary tear it apart. And now you're standing here, acting like I'm the problem, when all I wanted was to hold on to the pieces of Dad that you threw away. The room fell silent. My mom looked at me, her face a mix of guilt and frustration, while Gary just sat there, completely unbothered. I realized then that nothing I said would change how they saw the situation. To them, my dad's belongings were just objects, and my pain was just an inconvenience. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the house, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding, my chest felt tight, and my tears blurred the road as I drove away. For years, I had tried to make peace with my mom's new life, with Gary's presence in our family. But this was too much. They hadn't just betrayed my trust, they had betrayed my dad's memory. And as much as it hurt, I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. This was the last straw. Something inside me snapped as my mom's cold words hung in the air, her face impassive as though she couldn't comprehend the gravity of what she'd done. The years of simmering resentment and the sheer heartbreak of losing my dad's things without my consent boiled over. Don't you dare tell me what Dad would have wanted, I said, my voice trembling with fury. You didn't even ask me before you let Gary sell his things. You had no right. Gary, as if on cue, decided it was the perfect time to interject. Look, I don't think this is as big a deal as you're making it out to be. I cut him off, turning my glare on him. No, I said sharply. You don't get to talk. You came into this family and acted like you owned it. Those things weren't yours to sell. They weren't even Mom's. They were mine. The tension in the room was suffocating. My mom's expression faltered for the first time, the corners of her mouth tightening as if she was struggling to maintain her composure. But instead of the apology I so desperately needed, she said, I'm sorry you feel that way. Her voice was cold, detached, as if she were reading from a script. The lack of genuine remorse hit me like a second betrayal. That's all you have to say? I asked, my voice cracking. You're sorry I feel this way? Not sorry for what you did? For letting him erase Dad from this house like he never mattered? Gary rolled his eyes, clearly done with the conversation. It's not like we burned the stuff in a bonfire, he muttered. You're being overly dramatic. People sell old things all the time. Old things? I shot back, my voice rising. You mean the cameras he used to take pictures of our family? The jacket he wore every day? The watch he promised to pass down to me? Those weren't just things. They were pieces of him. Pieces you had no right to touch. My mom stepped forward then, her tone shifting to something more defensive. We didn't think it would be such a big deal, she said. If it mattered so much to you, why didn't you say something before? It's not like you've shown any interest in those things for years, because I thought they were safe. I said, my voice shaking. I thought I could trust you to protect them until I was ready. How was I supposed to know I needed to fight to keep my own dad's belongings? For a moment, my mom's expression softened, guilt flashing across her face. But just as quickly, it was gone. You can't hold on to everything forever, she said quietly. Life moves on, and you need to move on too. Her words were the final straw. Don't you dare tell me to move on, I said, my tone low and icy. You moved on the second Gary walked through that door, and you've spent every day since pretending Dad never existed. You let him erase everything that made this house feel like home, and now you're trying to erase him from my life too. Well, I'm not moving on, and I'm not letting you rewrite history to make yourselves feel better. The silence that followed was deafening. My mom looked at me, her eyes flickering with a mixture of anger and discomfort, but she said nothing. Gary leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, his indifference radiating through the room. For the first time, I realized how deeply the dynamic in this house had shifted. My mom wasn't just letting Gary make decisions. She was actively choosing to side with him over me, over the memory of my dad. I don't even know who you are anymore, I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. The mom I grew up with would have never let this happen. She would have fought to protect Dad's memory, not sell it off like a garage sale bargain. But I guess that mom doesn't exist anymore. I turned to leave, my heart pounding as tears blurred my vision. My mom called after me, her voice sharp with frustration. You're being unfair, she said. You're not the only one who lost him, you know. Do you think this was easy for me? I froze in the doorway, gripping the frame to steady myself. No, I said without turning around. But I never thought you'd make it harder for me. I walked out of the house, slamming the door behind me. My chest felt tight, and my legs were shaky as I got into my car. For a few moments, I just sat there, staring at the steering wheel, letting the weight of what had just happened settle over me. This was the breaking point. The line had been crossed, and there was no coming back. My relationship with my mom, and whatever strained civility I had with Gary, would never be the same. As I drove away, I felt a strange mix of grief and clarity. I had lost so much already. My dad, his belongings, and now, the illusion that my mom would always be on my side. But for the first time, I realized that I didn't need their approval or their validation. I had fought for my dad's memory on my own, and I would continue to do so, no matter how much it hurt. Because at the end of the day, protecting his legacy was all that mattered. And if my mom and Gary couldn't understand that, then they didn't deserve to be part of it. Leaving my mom's house that day felt like stepping away from a crumbling foundation. For years, I had clung to the hope that despite our differences, my relationship with my mom could withstand anything. But now, it felt irreparably broken. I didn't know if we could ever mend what had been torn apart. Not after the betrayal, the dismissiveness, and her refusal to see how much her choices had hurt me. As I drove away, the weight of what I'd lost settled over me. Not just my dad's belongings, but the trust one had in my mom to protect his memory. She had chosen convenience and Gary's whims over preserving something sacred, and that choice was a wound that would take a long time to heal. For the first few days, I was consumed by anger and sadness. I replayed the confrontation in my mind, wondering if I could have said something different, something that might have made her understand. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't have mattered. She had made her choice long before I walked into that house. Eventually, I realized that dwelling on what I couldn't change would only hurt me more. I couldn't undo what had been done, but I could focus on what was still possible. With the help of my friends, my real support system, I decided to tackle the one thing I still had control over, buying back my dad's watch. Zoe, my best friend, had been my rock throughout the entire ordeal. When I told her about the watch and the seller's outrageous price, she didn't hesitate. "We'll figure it out," she said. "You're not doing this alone." She helped me brainstorm ways to raise the money, and together, we reached out to friends, coworkers, and even some extended family members I was still close to. I was overwhelmed by their kindness. Some donated money, while others sold baked goods or hosted small fundraisers to contribute. After a few weeks, I finally had enough to make the purchase. I contacted the seller, who agreed to meet me in person. When I held the watch in my hands again, a wave of emotion washed over me. It felt like a piece of my dad had returned, and for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of peace. I never found the cameras or the jacket. I searched tirelessly, following every lead I could, but they seemed to have disappeared into the ether. For a while, the thought of never finding them haunted me, but I slowly came to accept that some things might be lost forever. Even so, I held on to hope. Hope that one day, I might stumble across them again. Hope that the universe might somehow bring them back to me. And in the meantime, I focused on preserving the memories I still had. Memories that no one could take away. Letting go of my anger wasn't easy. Every time I thought about Gary's smug indifference or my mom's cold dismissal, the resentment bubbled up all over again. But I knew that carrying that anger would only weigh me down. My dad wouldn't have wanted that for me. Instead, I channeled my energy into honoring his legacy in other ways. I started journaling about our memories together, writing down the little things I was afraid of forgetting. I framed one of the photos he had taken with his beloved cameras and hung it in my apartment, a constant reminder of his love and creativity. Moving forward didn't mean forgetting what had happened. The pain of my mom's betrayal was still there, like a scar that would never fully fade. But it didn't control me anymore. I began to find joy in the life I was building for myself, a life filled with friends who felt more like family, a career I was passionate about, and a growing sense of independence. Losing my dad's belongings had been devastating, but it also taught me something important. The people and things that truly matter can never be erased, no matter how hard others might try. My dad's love, his lessons, and his legacy lived on in me. And as long as I carried that with me, I knew I could face whatever came next. In the years that followed, I learned to carry my dad's memory in a way that didn't feel like a burden. The pain of losing his belongings never fully went away, but it dulled over time, replaced by a quiet understanding that his love and the lessons he'd given me couldn't be taken away. They were mine, woven into the fabric of who I was. I decided to create a space in my home to honor him, something small but meaningful. In one corner of my living room, I placed his watch in a glass case, surrounded by framed photographs he'd taken with the cameras I might never recover. One of those photos was my favorite, a candid shot of me and him laughing during a family barbecue. Whenever I felt overwhelmed or lost, I'd look at that photo and feel his presence, steady and reassuring. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to remind me of who he was and the bond we shared. Enough to remind me that his legacy wasn't confined to objects. It was alive in my memories, my values, and the way I chose to live my life. As for my mom and Gary, our relationship didn't survive the fallout. After that confrontation in their living room, I tried to stay in touch for a while, hoping time might heal the rift. But every phone call, every strained holiday visit, only deepened the chasm between us. My mom refused to acknowledge the pain she had caused or the role Gary had played in erasing my dad's presence from our lives. Eventually, I stopped trying. The truth was, I couldn't force her to see things from my perspective, and I couldn't keep reopening old wounds just to maintain a relationship that felt one-sided. Walking away wasn't easy, it never is, but it was necessary. I haven't spoken to them in years. There were times when I wondered if I'd made the right choice, but those doubts never lasted long. Forgiveness, I've learned, doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it's about letting go, not just of the pain, but of the people who refused to take accountability for causing it. Letting go didn't mean forgetting, though. I still think about my mom sometimes, about the person she used to be and the person she became. I wonder if she ever regrets what happened, or if she even thinks about me at all. But those thoughts don't consume me the way they once did. They come and go, like ripples on the surface of a calm lake. I've built a life for myself that's rich and full, surrounded by friends who feel more like family and a community that supports and uplifts me. My dad's memory is a constant source of strength. Whenever I face a tough decision or a moment of doubt, I ask myself what he would have done, what advice he would have given. I carry him with me in ways that no one can take away, and that has been the greatest comfort of all. Moving forward doesn't mean erasing the past. It means learning from it, growing from it, and using it to shape the person you want to become. My dad taught me that in his own quiet, steadfast way. And though he's no longer here, his lessons continue to guide me every day. I've found peace, not in the resolution of old conflicts, but in the realization that I don't need them to define my story. My dad's love, his legacy, and the life I've built for myself are more than enough. This is my new chapter, and for the first time in a long time, it feels like my story is truly my own.